Hey everybody, it's just time for an update on the IROC. It's time for a regularly scheduled service. One thing that bothers me a little bit is that the coolant level in the overflow bottle continues to drop. Now, years ago, I had a full-size Oldsmobile and I drove that car for over 100,000 miles. And my memory of it is that it always bothered me because the overflow bottle would deplete, and about every time I did an oil change I had to put a little bit in to bring it back to full. And it did that happily for 100,000 miles. Actually, when I sold the car, it had 140 on it. It was still running, big block 455 was running happy. But it's still always a little disconcerting. My position always has been that the vented bottles, not a sealed system, these cars have a vented bottle, is that the water in the overflow bottle can evaporate slowly and you'll get a little bit of loss. In any case, I sort of want to be sure there's nothing wrong with the new engine. So at this interval I'm going to take a little harder check. My plan is I'm going to make a couple measurements. I got my refractometer out here, and I'm going to make some measurements in the bottle and see what the concentration is, see what the concentration is in the radiator. I'm going to make a check with my, my radiator pressure checker and see if I'm getting any pressure back into the cooling system from the engine. There's a specific test for that too. So I'm going to run some diagnostic tests and see where they come out. And I'll show you in a minute. Going to run this refractometer first. So you can see on the bottle here at rest that I'm probably a ½ inch below the full cold mark. And probably 2 months ago, it was at about 2 months and 2,000 miles, it was probably only a ¼ of an inch down. I did find a very small leak. The petcock on the radiator was not fully tight, and it did seem as it was dripping a little bit, and I was hoping that would stop it. But so far my usage rate, the last time I topped it up was probably 3 or 4 months ago, and it took about 8 ounces, and that 8 ounces was from the time the engine was built over many months. I would guess from where it's at now it probably needs another 8 ounces to bring it up. But in the meantime, let's do a check. The way this works is we go in here and we get a few drops of antifreeze. Okay, this is the device. You look through the eyepiece, but you put a couple drops of coolant on there, and then you close the lid, and we take an eyeball reading on it, and it reads. Where's my ethylene glycol scale? Says 50%. Almost exactly, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 50%. See if the camera will get a good look at that. So from the blue line to the white line gives you the concentration, and the left-hand scale is ethylene glycol. The right hand would be if I was looking at propylene glycol. Pretty handy little device, and looks like a good concentration. And if I go into the radiator, then we'll wipe this off. Get a little bit out of the radiator. We put a couple drops on there, and we close this guy down. And she reads just about the same. Actually, just a couple bits lower. a couple degrees Fahrenheit lower. So you can kind of see where the blue line lines up there at about 49%. So that would suggest that the coolant, whatever's in the bottle, is mixing very well with what's in the radiator, which is kind of to be expected, but what I wondered was whether the water was just evaporating out of the bottle. But alright, so my pressure checker, I've been running for a half hour, and I ended up with the pressure just a little high. It was about 16.5. I was aiming for 15. I pushed too hard. And it's bled back a little. It's lost 1 psi in a half hour. And I've been going over the whole engine with a mirror and a flashlight. I don't see any external leaks. But frankly, I'm not, from other things I've done in the past, I don't know that that level of pressure change is a concern. When you pump it up like this, hoses expand under pressure and start to stretch a little bit, and so it would seem to indicate there could be a leak. So I'm going to keep looking further. But again, a 1 psi change in a half hour doesn't seem horrible. So I'm going to fire the car up to prepare to put it up on the ramp. While I'm underneath, I'm going to take a harder look and make sure there aren't any more any signs of leakage underneath. Okay, the engine's warmed up, and with the cap off, and I've put on my adapter, and it's probably going to be messy, so I moved it to outside. The idea is I'm going to fire it up, and then I'm going to put the pressure checker on it since it's already been up on the thermostat. The upper hose is hot, so it should be running on the stat, and the coolant should be pretty well expanded. So I'm going to put the pressure gauge on it and see what kind of response I get. And the answer so far, seems to be nothing. In other words, the engine is warmed up, and there's no pressure on the system. Double check, we're pretty much on the thermostat. And what I'm looking for is, just because I'm chasing down this coolant leak, or coolant loss, I should call it, do I have a head gasket problem? And if I had a head gasket problem, it should show up as significant pressure in the coolant system. And what I've got is about 1 psi, but the engine is continuing to warm up. Even though the thermostat's open, the engine's getting hot. But I see no pulsation, no evidence that there's a pressure build in the system from a bad head gasket. It looks pretty doggone solid. Got about 4 psi on there as the engine finishes warming up. I mean, the fans don't turn on in this engine until you get the 220 or something. So I'm going to let it idle a little longer and see if the pressure comes up, and I'm going to put a little bit more pressure on the system to see how it responds and whether it changes its response. The main thing is I don't want to go over about 16, 17 pounds, so I got to be a little careful. gauge is showing it up to about 220 now. We're real close to the fan coming in. And that gauge is as solid as a rock. There's no vibration in it or anything. Don't want to overpressurize the system, so I'm up to about 17. Now that it's shut off, she's dropping a little bit, as it should, because it'll cool off. But I don't see any evidence of pressure pulsation, like I've got a head gasket issue. That dude is solid as a rock, and the pressure only was going up by temperature. I kind of wish these cars had a fan that came in a little bit lower, but it is what it is. After I did the testing, I decided to try to do a little bit of analytical work to see if I could understand what I would expect the evaporation rate in the bottle to be. And I searched around on the internet. It was hard to find papers. There weren't many, but I did find this one in particular that was pretty applicable. It's entitled Ethylene Glycol Water Evaporation Lab Data. And it was written, you can see the authors here on the second line, back and posted in 2005. And finally, there's a PDF, a link to a file if you wanted to go look up this for yourself. This particular chart came out of their paper. It measures the evaporation rate in milligrams per minute against the mole fraction of ethylene glycol. And mole fraction is a chemical concentration measurement. I haven't done one of those in very many years. I haven't been into my chemistry for a long time. I had to go back and look it up and understand how to recalculate that. But eventually I was successful. The concentration that I did was at 50% mix, 50% water, 50% glycol, like we would use in our cars. The answer was 0.225 was the mole fraction. So if you go over to the chart, the red boxes are the two that I'm using. So that's 0.225 at a low temperature of 298 K, which converts to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The upper box is for the hot, which is 328 K or 131 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be more consistent with us with a underhood and a hot temperature. But kind of would look at what the range is that's available to you. So then if you go, I'm going to walk through the calculation from the lower bound. Oh yes, the pan is 0.739 centimeters squared. So you end up with a 0.2 milligram per minute rate at that mole fraction across that temperature. And so you'll see the calculation for 50%, 77 degrees, 0.2 against that 0.739 square centimeter, that then you have to convert to a full square centimeter, which makes it 0.27 milligrams per minute per square centimeter. So then if you drop down to the 136, I calculated 6.5 by 6.5 inch bottle and assumed it's triangular based on the wheelhouse intruding on it. So I end up with 136 square centimeters of overflow bottle. Multiplied by 0.27 is 36.7 milligrams per minute. So then if you want to get up to 1,000 milligrams, to a full gram, it's 1,000 divided by the 36.7, or basically 1 gram
every 27.2 minutes. So then if you drop down to the next level, if you go to 8 fluid ounces, which is about what I lost over the winter in the garage, 8 ounces is around 230 to 237, depends on exactly the density you're using. But it's 237 grams of water. And that 237 will cause 6,446 minutes, which calculates to about 4.5 days at 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if you did it hot, you'd end up at about 1,100 minutes or 18 hours at 131, which incidentally, if you drove at 30 miles an hour, that's about 500 miles of driving if you did a 30 mile an hour average cross time. So it's an interesting calculation. It's a lot more than I would have expected, because certainly I don't lose 8 ounces in 4 days. I lose 8 ounces in 4 months. So part of the difference is probably in the fact that we really don't have an open bottle. We have a vented bottle, and the cap has a labyrinth arrangement, with some small holes in it that allow it to vent. But it's not the atmosphere inside the bottle has a lot of water vapor probably and glycol vapor in it. It's not like being totally open air as this test should have been. And I couldn't tell from the paper what their relative humidity was. So in any case, this kind of gives you an idea, where this should end up. And it's not unusual for a vented bottle to want to vent. So that's all for now, and back again later with my next video.